There's a lot of talk about the average age of a first-time buyer here in the UK. And as you know, I'm an advocate for owning your property that you live in because that gives you an asset that you can use for holistic financial planning later on in life, particularly if you don't have a pension or you've not been investing along the way. But it did get me thinking, if the average age for a first-time buyer is a lot higher than it used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago, what does the current average age for someone buying a home in the UK compare to when you look at other countries like the US, Canada, Germany? There's a list of countries we're going to go through here. And one in particular stood out to me, and it's worth a conversation because the average house price and the average first-time buyer age are both quite high. And I think when you compare it to the UK, you'll be surprised at how much higher it is, and particularly the average house price. And we'll talk about why that is. And if you've been to this country, I've driven through it a couple of times, it's beautiful. So it kind of makes sense. But the reason why I'm making this is because in the current state of affairs, the way the country is going, people may feel disillusioned. I know people feel disillusioned working towards getting a house deposit together. And that's one of the big challenges, that and property prices. Hopefully by having something we can compare ourselves to will hopefully give us a sense that we're not in it on our own, or you're not in it on your own. So let's jump straight in with the domestic numbers, and this is according to the Halifax and government sources. So in the UK, the current average age for a first-time buyer is 32 years old, and the average property price is £270,000. Now, it is worthwhile mentioning we are talking in averages here, right? So we're looking at the country as a whole, and it will obviously strip out the fact that London and around the M25 naturally are more expensive, and certain cities are more expensive. This is taking in conjunction all of those high metro areas or popular areas, cities, and mixing it in with rural areas as well. So this is an average across the country. Now, if you go straight across the pond to the US, the average age in the US is 33, and the average American home costs £350,000 according to the National Association of Realtors in the United States. Now, the UK-US, economically, if you've been following the inflation news, all that kind of stuff, we are very closely related in terms of how things tend to feel from an economic point of view and economic policy. It's very, very different in terms of the economic picture though. America is quite large. Their economy is completely different to ours. It's still the largest in the world. We are struggling at this point in time, but there isn't too much of a difference between the average age and the average property price in the United States. Then we just go straight across and we have a look at Canada. Okay, so now Canada is really interesting because the average age in Canada is 36 years old, and the average Canadian home is going to cost you 700,000 Canadian dollars. I'll do the conversion in terms of what that means in British pounds on the screen here so you can see that. So those numbers come from the Canadian Real Estate Association. Now let's have a look at the land down under, which is Australia. And that's the average age is 36 years old, with the average home costing $800,000 according to Court Logic. So Canada, Australia, kind of average ages are the same. I don't know the conversions. Again, I'll put them up here. We'll see if they're in the same ballpark or not. Now, interestingly, Germany, let's come into Europe now. In Germany, and they have very different sentiments about home ownership in Europe. The average age in Europe is between 35 and 40. And the average home in Germany costs anywhere between 300,000 euros and 500,000 euros for a typical home, which is interesting. Now that's a little closer to home, but much, much larger. But the one that I think is really interesting, and again, if you've been to this country, it's beautiful, it may make sense to you, but the average age in the country of Switzerland, so this is for the Swiss, the average age is between 35 and 40, but the average property in Switzerland costs 1 million Swiss francs. Quite a big disparity in terms of, if you're looking at domestic currency, property values that go along. And again, I'm doing this because it's worthwhile us juxtaposing where we are in relation to other countries across the globe. And yes, domestic markets are very, very different. But by pointing this out, not only does it kind of paint the picture that, okay, our average age for a first-time buyer isn't as high as perhaps we're expecting it to be. And when we compare it to other countries, according to this, we've actually got the lowest average age. Now, that doesn't mean that we're on a bed of roses. Absolutely not. And if you look at this information from a holistic point of view, you could argue that there is one thing that is clear, that property in itself seems to be in short supply, which basically means that you have high demand, short supply, pushing up property prices. And that is glaringly obvious when you look at the factors that mean that in Switzerland, the average home costs 1 million Swiss francs. If you have a look at things like interest rates, and this is one of the things that is worthwhile speaking about, one of the reasons why property prices are higher in Switzerland is because they've had really favorable interest rates. And I wanted to do a comparison where we had a look at what lending rates were like for Switzerland, comparing it directly to, the UK. So get ready for this, by the way, because this data is from the Swiss Bankers Association. And I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. Now, in 2019, the average 5-year fixed rate mortgage in Switzerland was around 1 to 1.5%. Now, that isn't too dissimilar because in the UK back in 2019, the average 2-year fixed rate mortgage was between 1.6 and 2%. But since 2019, you all know what's happened. We've had inflation, energy crisis, and that has meant monetary policy has shifted. We've seen the Bank of England base rate go up, which has basically then pushed mortgage rates up. And we still are at a high right now. Now let's fast forward to 2023 in Switzerland. The rates in Switzerland, these are for mortgages, by the way, rates have approximately been around 1.5 to 2%. 1.5 to 2% in Switzerland in 2023. When you compare that to us in the UK, our average mortgage rate was between 4.5% and 5% in 2003. Now, that is connected to the fact that since 2019, or at least for some time now, in Switzerland, they've actually had negative interest rates. And when you have negative interest rates, the cost to borrow money on things like mortgages is so much cheaper. It's horrible for savers because effectively, if you have money in a bank that is offering negative interest rates, you're paying the bank to hold your money. But just to give you a flavor of this and some context, let me just find it on my chart right here. In 2019, the Swiss National Bank had a policy rate of minus 0.75%. Fast forward to 2023, and this is amongst inflation for most of the Western economies in Europe. Their bank rate, their policy bank rate is still minus 0.25%. And that is why what you see is pretty much their mortgage rates not really changing. It's gone up by 0.5% amongst all of this. It's a really, really interesting conversation to be had. Now, I want to end this video on maybe just some words of encouragement. I do talk about mortgages. I do talk about interest rates. We talk about inflation here. This is a topic that kind of plugs into that, right? But it's not directly linked in a way. I've tried to make the connection in this video. And the reason why we're trying to broaden out the topics a little bit more is so that we can, you at least as viewers, will know how to connect some of these topics together. So when you're making financial decisions, you're going to know how they connect and what that essentially means for you. Now, in 2024, property prices are still rising in the UK. Yes, you could argue that other areas have a higher average first-time buyer's age and higher average property prices locally, and the conversions again would have been on screen for you to view. But what I want to say is that I know that a lot of people feel like it's completely impossible, and there's this conversation around renting versus buying. I think ultimately you've got to find the right answer for you. And if you do decide that you do want to buy your own property, financial discipline is really what's going to get you there. That and your ability to earn more money if you can, particularly if you're in a position where you're in a career that doesn't necessarily lend itself to high wages. You might have to pivot. You might have to do something a little bit different. You might have to think outside the box. If you're inside the M25, you need to be a high earner to get on the property ladder there. That is just the reality of it. Unless you have friends, family, relatives that gift you money, inheritance, or whatever it might be to help you. But in those areas, M25, inside the M25, you're going to need high earnings to be able to do so. And I know people personally who are choosing to buy outside of London, outside of the M25. I mean, if you go down to Tunbridge Wells in Kent, it's expensive there because of the commuter distance into London being relatively short. So people are going a little bit further afield. And I think in a situation or an economy where people can still work from home, and that may be changing in the next year or two. We're seeing more companies asking people to come back into the office. It lends itself well to this idea of perhaps looking at locations outside of maybe your preference. And unfortunately, that is a very real compromise that people are having to make right now. But in the context of this video, I just wanted to show you what the wider picture looks like. It's very, very easy to feel like, you're alone and all of the problems seem to be, on you, and it's not necessarily the same for everybody else. I hope that's kind of brought a little bit of an insight. But if you do have any questions on mortgages, property, well, not necessarily property because I'm not a property guy, but mortgages, saving for a deposit, that kind of stuff, please leave them in the comment section down below. If you want to see more content on this, or you would like me to run like a private workshop on saving for a deposit, the factors that you need to be mindful of when it comes to, once you've saved for your deposit, approaching the bank for a mortgage, interest rates, the kind of mortgages that are out there, things on your credit score that you need to be mindful of. And by the way, if you've picked up my book, the credit score chapter is perfect because I cover all of this in here. Let me know and I'll run something privately for a small group of people. As you know, I'm also a qualified mortgage advisor. This is something I've actually worked with as well. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know your opinion down below. Were you surprised at any of the average ages? Were you surprised at any of the average property prices in those other countries that we've mentioned there? And would you move? Would you move to another country? I don't know. Would you? Let me know. Cheers.